Unspoken Secrets of the 49th-Day Memorial Meal. David and his family are deeply shaken after the sudden passing of his mother, a strong and devoted matriarch. As tradition dictates, they prepare offerings for the 49-day ritual to guide her spirit to the afterlife. But instead of closure, they are haunted by eerie events. Mysterious sounds echo through the house, objects move on their own, and their loyal dog senses an unseen presence. David is tormented by his mother's cryptic final words, "Is there," which seem to hint at a hidden truth. The situation spirals when the family discovers a faded photograph of their mother holding a baby no one recognizes, buried among her belongings. Strange happenings intensify as a pale apparition of their mother appears, enraged and full of sorrow. But she points toward an unknown corner of the house and accuses them of forgetting something or someone. Desperate to end the torment, the family uncovers a heartbreaking secret, a forgotten child their mother never mentioned, whose spirit has lingered in anger and sorrow. But only by performing a final ritual to honor both spirits can the family restore peace, but not without facing the terrifying force of the supernatural. Part 1. A Mother's Passing. The house was eerily quiet, as if mourning alongside David and his family. The air felt thick, heavy with the weight of grief that had lingered since the day his mother passed. She had been the cornerstone of their lives, a woman of unyielding strength who had raised her children through poverty and hardship. Even in her final years, she carried herself with dignity, her sharp eyes and unwavering spirit defying her frail body. David sat silently at the kitchen table, his gaze fixed on the flickering flame of the single candle that lit the room. It was his mother's favorite spot, where she had spent countless evenings peeling vegetables or sewing clothes for the family. Now, the emptiness of the chair across from him was unbearable. "She didn't even look sick," he murmured, his voice trembling. She was fine, until that night his wife, Susan, placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "You know how these things happen, David. Sometimes they just go quickly. She didn't suffer." David nodded, though her words brought little comfort. He couldn't forget the sight of his mother on her final day, lying weakly on the bed, her chest rising and falling with labored breaths. She had whispered something before she passed, her hand lifting feebly to point toward the corner of the room. "It's there," she had said, her voice barely audible. Her hand fell limp moments later, and she was gone. David's younger brother, Michael, had rushed into the room too late to hear her. When David told him what their mother had said, Michael dismissed it as the ramblings of someone on the brink of death. But David couldn't shake the feeling that her words carried meaning. It's there. What had she meant? What was she pointing at? On the 49th day after her death, the family prepared for the traditional offering ritual. According to their belief, the soul lingers for 49 days, caught between worlds, before it transitions to the afterlife. During this time, offerings of food and prayers were set to ease the spirit's journey. Susan and David worked in silence as they arranged the altar. It was simple but respectful, adorned with their mother's favorite dishes: steamed rice, stir-fried vegetables, and a bowl of herbal tea. 3 small incense sticks stood upright in the burner, waiting to be lit. Michael entered the room, carrying a photograph of their mother in her younger years. She would have liked this, he said, setting the photo on the altar. She always said food brings families together. Even now, she's making us sit down to eat. David forced a smile, though his chest ached with sadness. His mother had always insisted on family meals, no matter how busy life became. Even during the hardest times, when there was barely enough food to go around, she had found a way to bring everyone to the table. As they finished the preparations, the sky outside darkened. A storm was rolling in, heavy clouds swallowing the late afternoon light. Thunder rumbled faintly in the distance, and a cool breeze swept through the house. Susan shivered. "It feels colder than usual," she said, glancing at the window. David didn't reply. He was staring at the altar, his eyes drawn to the small bowl of rice in the center. It was perfectly arranged, as if their mother herself had placed it there. A strange sensation crept over him, a feeling that they were being watched. When the clock struck 7, the family gathered in the living room for the ritual. David and Michael lit the incense sticks and bowed their heads, muttering prayers for their mother's peace. The flickering flames cast shadows on the walls, their shapes shifting and twisting with the wind that slipped through the cracks in the windows. Susan knelt beside David, her hands clasped tightly in prayer. The soft hum of their voices filled the room, mingling with the sound of rain that had begun to fall outside. The ritual should have been comforting, a way to honor their mother and say a final goodbye. But David couldn't shake the unease building in his chest. It began as a faint sound, a soft scraping, like nails dragging across wood. David's eyes snapped open, and he looked around the room, his heart pounding. The others didn't seem to notice, their heads still bowed in prayer. He tried to ignore it, convincing himself it was just the wind. But then the sound grew louder. Scrape, scrape, scrape. David's breath caught in his throat. The sound was coming from the altar. Slowly he turned his head, his eyes locking on the bowl of rice. His heart skipped a beat as he saw it tilt slightly, as if something unseen had nudged it. The rice began to spill onto the altar, grain by grain, until the bowl tipped over completely. Susan's voice broke the silence, pulling him from his trance. She followed his gaze and gasped. What? How did that happen? I don't know, David stammered, his voice shaking. I didn't touch it, Michael stood, his expression a mixture of confusion and concern. Maybe the table's uneven, he suggested, though he didn't sound convinced. David shook his head. The table was solid, unmoving. He glanced at the altar again, his mother's photo staring back at him with an expression that seemed almost accusatory. That night, as the family tried to sleep, David lay awake, his mind racing. He couldn't stop thinking about the bowl of rice, about his mother's final words, about the strange feeling that something wasn't right. Every creak of the old house made him jump. Every gust of wind outside made his skin crawl. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath, willing himself to sleep. But just as he began to drift off, he heard it again. Scrape, scrape, scrape. This time it was coming from the kitchen. David's eyes flew open, and he sat up, his heart pounding in his chest. He reached for the oil lamp on the bedside table, its faint light casting long shadows as he crept toward the door. Susan's sleepy voice called from behind him. Where are you going? There's something in the kitchen, he whispered. I'll be back. Her wide eyes followed him as he stepped into the dark hallway, the lamp trembling in his hand. The sound grew louder as he approached the kitchen door. He hesitated, every instinct screaming at him to turn back. But he pushed the door open, the lamp's glow revealing an empty room. Or so he thought. As he stepped closer to the altar, the temperature seemed to drop. His breath fogged in the air, and his hands shook as he held the lamp higher. The rice bowl had been uprighted, and the spilled grains were gone. The offering looked exactly as it had before the ritual. Impossible, he whispered, his voice barely audible. Then from the corner of the room he heard a faint whisper. It's there, ... David froze, his blood turning to ice. The voice was unmistakable. It was his mother's. Part 2. A cryptic last word. The memory of that final day was etched deeply into David's mind, playing on a loop whenever he closed his eyes. He could still hear the faint rustle of the bedsheets, the shallow gasps of her fading breath, and most vividly, her trembling voice. It's there, she had whispered, her frail hand lifting toward the corner of the room. At the time, David had been frozen, unable to make sense of her words. His mother's face, once so vibrant and full of life, now looked hollow, her eyes glassy yet strangely fixated on something unseen. Her hand hovered in the air for a fleeting moment before falling limp, her chest rising one last time before everything fell silent. The room had filled with an unbearable stillness. David had stared at the corner she had pointed to, expecting, almost hoping to see something that would explain her cryptic words. But there had been nothing, just a cracked beige wall, dimly lit by the bedside lamp. Days passed, but David couldn't let go of her final utterance. He wandered through the house in a fog of grief, his mind replaying the scene over and over. What did she mean? What was there? He found himself staring at that corner of the room at odd hours, searching for clues. A part of him felt foolish. Maybe it was just the delirium of her last moments, a meaningless fragment of thought from a dying mind. Yet another part of him couldn't ignore the sharp intensity in her voice, the way her eyes seemed to lock onto something only she could see. Late one evening, as rain pattered softly against the windows, David sat in his mother's room, the air thick with the faint scent of lavender she used to love. The lamp's warm glow illuminated the small space, casting shadows that danced on the walls with every flicker of the flame. His gaze drifted once again to that corner, the same one that had haunted him since her death. "What were you trying to tell me?" he whispered to the empty room, his voice breaking. The question hung unanswered in the air. One afternoon, while sorting through his mother's belongings, David came across a small wooden box tucked away in the bottom drawer of her wardrobe. The box was unremarkable, its surface worn smooth with age, the latch slightly rusted. Curious, he opened it, revealing an assortment of old trinkets, a faded photograph of her as a young woman, a pair of pale earrings she rarely wore, and a yellowing envelope sealed with wax. David's hands trembled as he picked up the envelope. The seal had a peculiar symbol, something he didn't recognize. He hesitated for a moment before breaking it open. Inside was a single piece of paper, the edges frayed and brittle. The words scrawled across it were brief but chilling: "Do not forget him. He is dead." David's heart raced. The handwriting was unmistakably his mother's, but the message raised more questions than answers. Who was him? And why had she hidden this note away? Unable to shake the unease gnawing at him, David decided to confront his younger brother, Michael. Sitting at the dining table, he placed the note in front of him. Michael picked it up, his brow furrowing as he read the cryptic message. "What does this even mean?" Michael asked, his voice tinged with skepticism. "Who's him?" "And why would she write something like this?" David shook his head. "I don't know. But it has to be connected to what she said before she died. Is there?" She pointed to the corner of her room. Michael leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "Look, David, I know this has been hard on you. It's been hard on all of us. But maybe this doesn't mean anything. Mom was old. She could have been confused." David's frustration flared. "She wasn't confused, Michael. You didn't see the way she looked when she said it. She wasn't just pointing at random. She knew something was there." Michael sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Okay, let's say you're right. What are you planning to do about it?" "Tear apart the house looking for clues." David didn't respond, but deep down he knew he couldn't let it go. He had to find out what his mother had meant, no matter how unsettling the truth might be. That night, unable to sleep, David found himself once again in his mother's room. The corner she had pointed to loomed in the dim light, drawing him like a moth to a flame. He grabbed a flashlight and began inspecting the area, tapping the walls, pulling aside furniture, and lifting the edge of the old rug that lay on the floor. Hours passed, and David found nothing out of the ordinary. Frustrated, he sank to the floor, leaning back against the wall. His flashlight flickered, casting erratic shadows that made the small room feel even more claustrophobic. As he sat in the silence, he thought he heard something, a faint whisper, barely audible, like the rustle of leaves in the wind. "It's there." David's blood ran cold. The voice was faint, but unmistakably his mother's. His heart pounded as he whipped his flashlight toward the corner, the beam of light trembling as his hand shook. There was nothing there. "Get a grip," he muttered to himself, his voice cracking. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone in the room. The following day, Susan found him in the kitchen, nursing a cup of coffee, his eyes hollow and bloodshot. "You look awful," she said, sitting down across from him. Did you sleep at all? David shook his head. I can't. Every time I close my eyes I hear her voice. I feel like she's trying to tell me something, but I don't understand. Suzanne reached for his hand, her grip firm. David, you're torturing yourself. Maybe this is her way of saying goodbye. Maybe you just need to let her go. I want to, David said, his voice barely above a whisper. But I can't, and I know the truth. That evening, Michael returned with an old family photo album, hoping it might provide some answers. The three of them sat around the dining table, flipping through the worn pages. Most of the pictures were familiar family gatherings, birthdays, vacations. But as they neared the end of the album, David stopped on a photograph he didn't recognize. The picture was of their mother, much younger, standing in front of an old wooden house. She was holding a baby, smiling softly. But something about the photo felt off. David pointed to it. Who's this? Michael frowned. I don't know. That's not me. And it's definitely not you. Susan studied the photo, her brow furrowing. Could she have had another child, someone before you? David's mind raced. Could the baby in the photo be the him his mother had mentioned? If so, why had she never told them about him? And what had happened to him? As the storm outside intensified, the family sat in uneasy silence, the questions piling up. David's gaze drifted to the corner of the room, his mother's words echoing in his mind as their dot for the first time. He began to wonder if the truth wasn't just hidden, but something far darker. Part 3. The first ominous sign. The 49th-day ritual was meant to bring solace, a final act of love to guide the spirit of the deceased into the afterlife. David hoped it would ease his lingering grief, but as the family gathered that evening, the air in the house felt unusually heavy. The flickering candles on the altar cast restless shadows on the walls, as if something unseen was moving within the room. The family sat cross-legged in the dimly lit living room. The altar, lovingly arranged with his mother's favorite dishes, stood in quiet reverence before them. Steamed rice in 3 small bowls, a plate of salted greens, and a bowl of herbal tea were placed carefully next to her photo. Incense sticks smoldered in the burner, their tendrils of smoke curling upward in ghostly spirals. David, his younger brother Michael, and Susan bowed their heads in prayer. Their voices wove together, murmuring words for their mother's peace. But David's concentration wavered as a strange chill swept over him, prickling the hairs on the back of his neck. He tried to ignore it, convincing himself it was just the draft from the storm brewing outside. And then it happened. The faintest sound broke the silence, a soft, deliberate tap against the altar. David's eyes flicked open, scanning the room. His family continued their prayers, seemingly oblivious. He thought he must have imagined it. But then there it was again. Tap, tap. His chest tightened as he turned his gaze toward the altar. The middle bowl of rice was trembling, its edges barely perceptibly moving. For a moment he thought it was his own unsteady breath, but he wasn't close enough to disturb it. The bowl tilted, its contents spilling onto the table in slow motion, as though an unseen hand had pushed it over. Did you see that? David's voice broke the rhythm of their prayers. Susan and Michael looked up, startled. See what? Michael asked. The rice, David said, pointing. It tipped over. By itself. Michael's brow furrowed as he leaned forward. The spilled grains glimmered faintly in the candlelight. Maybe the table's uneven, he said, though his tone lacked conviction. David shook his head. No, that table hasn't moved in years. Susan placed a hand on his arm, her eyes wide with concern. David, it's probably just the wind. You're stressed. It wasn't the wind, David interrupted, his voice rising. I know what I saw. They resumed the ritual, but the tension in the room was palpable. David couldn't focus on the prayers. His eyes kept drifting back to the altar, his heart pounding with every flicker of the candles. The rice bowl, now empty, seemed to taunt him. After the ritual ended, the family sat together, eating quietly. The mood was somber, weighed down by the earlier incident. David barely touched his food, his appetite gone. Michael attempted to lighten the atmosphere with idle conversation, but even he couldn't shake the unease lingering in the air. It was Susan who finally spoke up. "David, do you think it could be her?" "Your mother." David froze, the thought sending a shiver down his spine. "Why would she do that? She loved us. She wouldn't try to scare us." "Maybe it's not her trying to scare us," Susan said softly. "Maybe she's trying to tell us something." That night, David lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. The room was silent except for the rhythmic tapping of rain against the windows. Susan slept soundly beside him, her breathing even and calm, but David couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching him. He turned onto his side, his eyes drawn to the door. It was slightly ajar, and through the sliver of space he could see the faint glow of the altar in the next room. He hadn't extinguished the candles, a small comfort against the oppressive darkness. "Creak." David shot up in bed, his heart pounding. The sound had come from the hallway, a floorboard groaning under weight. He strained his ears, holding his breath. Creak, creak. Someone or something was moving outside. The faint sound of footsteps echoed, slow and deliberate. David's chest tightened as he reached for the lamp on the bedside table, but his hands were trembling so much he nearly knocked it over. "David." Susan mumbled groggily, her voice heavy with sleep. "What's wrong?" "Stay here," he whispered, his voice barely audible. He grabbed the lamp and crept toward the door, each step measured and silent. The hallway stretched before him, shrouded in darkness. The faint glow of the altar was the only source of light. The air was cold, unnaturally so, and the chill seemed to seep into his very bones. As he approached the altar, he noticed something strange. The incense sticks, which should have burned out hours ago, were still smoldering. The smoke no longer rose in gentle spirals but twisted erratically, as if disturbed by an invisible force. Then from the kitchen came a new sound. Scrape, scrape, scrape. David froze, his pulse hammering in his ears. The noise was metallic, grating, a knife dragging against the counter, perhaps, or a chair being moved across the tile floor. He wanted to call out, but his throat felt constricted, as if fear itself were gripping him. He forced himself to move, each step heavier than the last. The kitchen door was slightly ajar, a faint sliver of light spilling through. He pushed it open slowly, the creak of the hinges echoing in the silence. The kitchen was empty, or so it seemed. The chairs were neatly tucked under the table, and the countertops were clean, save for the remnants of dinner, but the scraping sound continued, low and rhythmic. David's eyes followed the sound to the far corner of the room. His blood ran cold. The wooden cutting board, which had been leaning against the wall, was sliding across the counter on its own. It moved slowly, deliberately, as if pushed by an unseen hand. David could do nothing but stare, his mind racing to find a rational explanation. "Who's there?" he finally managed to croak, his voice trembling. The scraping stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. David's breathing was ragged, his chest heaving as adrenaline coursed through him. He took a tentative step forward, his hand gripping the lamp tightly. And then from the far end of the room came a faint whisper. "It's there, ... David stumbled backward, nearly dropping the lamp. The voice was faint but unmistakably his mother's. His eyes darted to the altar, as if seeking confirmation that it was her spirit. But nothing had changed. The candles still burned, their flame steady and unyielding. He turned and bolted out of the kitchen, his footsteps echoing in the hallway. When he reached the bedroom, he slammed the door shut behind him, his chest heaving. "What happened?" Susan sat up, her face pale with worry. I don't know," David stammered, his voice barely audible. "Something's not right. It's like she's trying to tell me something. But why like this?" Susan didn't have an answer. She wrapped her arms around him, trying to calm his trembling body. But as they sat in the darkness, neither of them could shake the feeling that they were no longer alone in the house. Part 4. The Dog's Warning. The following evening, the rain continued its relentless assault, a cold, steady drumming against the windows of David's house. The storm outside seemed to mirror the unease inside, as if nature itself conspired to magnify the tension that had been building over the past few days. Dinner had been a quiet affair, with David, Susan, and Michael each lost in their thoughts. None of them mentioned the strange events during the ritual, though the memory of the overturned rice and eerie sounds lingered unspoken. After dinner, the family gathered once more in the living room for the second evening of the 49th-Day ritual. This time they added an extra bowl of rice to the altar, Susan's idea, meant as a gesture of appeasement for whatever force seemed to be unsettling the household. David lit the incense, his hands trembling slightly as he whispered a prayer for his mother. Michael sat nearby, his brows furrowed as he watched the smoke curl and twist in the dim light. Even the normally pragmatic Michael had grown uneasy, though he refused to admit it out loud. The family's dog, a gentle Labrador named Max, lay curled up in his usual spot near the altar. Max had been a source of comfort since their mother's passing, his calm presence a reminder of normalcy amidst the turmoil. But tonight, something was different. As the family's murmured prayers filled the room, Max suddenly lifted his head, his ears pricked and alert. He stared at the altar, his body tense, and let out a low growl. The sound was so uncharacteristic that it stopped David mid-sentence. "What's wrong with him?" Susan asked, her voice barely above a whisper. David glanced at Max, frowning. The dog was now standing, his hackles raised, his growl deepening into a rumble that sent a shiver down David's spine. Max's eyes were fixed on the altar, unblinking and intense, as if he could see something the rest of them couldn't. "Max," David called softly, trying to soothe the dog, but Max didn't respond. Instead, he took a cautious step forward, his growl turning into a bark, sharp, loud, and filled with alarm. "Stop it," Michael said, his voice louder than intended. He stood and reached for the dog, but Max darted away, barking furiously now. His movements were frantic, erratic, as if he were trying to ward off an unseen threat. The dog's barks echoed through the house, heightening the tension in the room. The candles on the altar flickered violently, their flames bending as though caught in an invisible wing. The incense smoke swirled chaotically, no longer drifting upward in gentle spirals, but spinning in frantic, erratic patterns. "What's happening?" Susan's voice was tight with fear as she clutched David's arm. Before anyone could answer, a sudden gust of icy wind blew through the room, extinguishing the altar candles in an instant. The darkness that followed was suffocating, broken only by the faint glow of the storm outside. The silence was shattered by Max's sharp, high-pitched whine as he bolted from the room, his tail tucked between his legs. "Max," David called after him, but the dog was already gone, his nails clicking against the hardwood floor as he disappeared into the hallway. David grabbed the flashlight from the table and flicked it on, the beam cutting through the darkness. He scanned the room, his breath shallow and quick. The altar looked untouched, but the air felt different, charged, oppressive. It pressed down on them like an invisible weight. "We need to relight the candle," Susan said, her voice trembling. Now Michael fumbled with the lighter, his usually steady hand shaking. The flame sputtered weakly, but it refused to catch the wicks of the candles. "It's not working," he muttered, his frustration mounting. "Try again," Susan urged, her eyes darting toward the darkened hallway where Max had fled. "We can't leave it like this." David took the lighter from Michael and tried himself, but the result was the same. The flame flickered but wouldn't hold. It was as if the very air around the altar rejected the light. A sudden thump echoed from the hallway, followed by a low, guttural growl. David's flashlight whipped toward the sound, illuminating Max standing at the edge of the kitchen. The dog's stance was rigid, his teeth bared, his growl rumbling deep in his chest. He stared into the kitchen, his gaze fixed on something in the shadows. "What's he looking at?" Michael asked, his voice barely audible. "I don't know," David replied, his throat dry. He stepped closer, the beam of the flashlight trembling in his hand. The kitchen appeared empty, but Max's reaction told a different story. The dog barked once, loud and sharp, before retreating, his body trembling. He turned and ran upstairs, leaving the family rooted in place, their fear mounting with every passing second. "Something's in this house," Susan whispered, her voice quaking. "Something's here with us," Michael scoffed, though the unease in his eyes betrayed him. "It's just a coincidence. The wind, the storm." "This isn't the wind," David snapped, his voice louder than he intended. "You saw the candles, you saw Max. He's never acted like this before." Susan grabbed David's arm, her grip tight. What if it's her? What if she's upset? Maybe we did something wrong. David's mind raced. Could his mother's spirit truly be angry? They had followed the ritual to the letter, or so he thought. But then he remembered her cryptic last words, "Is there, Dot?" Was there something they had overlooked? Something she wanted them to find? "We need to check the altar," David said, his voice firm despite the tremor in his hands. They approached the altar cautiously, the flashlight casting long, distorted shadows on the walls. The spilled rice from the night before had been cleaned, and the offerings looked undisturbed, but the oppressive feeling remained, as if the very air around the altar pulsed with unseen energy. David leaned closer, his eyes scanning every detail. The photo of his mother seemed different somehow, her expression almost changed. He shook his head, dismissing the thought, as his imagination playing tricks on him. Then, from the corner of the room came a faint whisper. "Is there ... The sound was barely audible, but it sent an icy chill down David's spine. He spun around, the flashlight beam darting across the room. But there was nothing, only the storm howling outside, and the faint creak of the house settling. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice breaking. Susan and Michael exchanged uneasy glances. "Hear what?" Michael asked. David swallowed hard, his heart pounding in his chest. Her voice, I heard her voice. The rest of the night passed in a haze of fear and uncertainty. The family huddled together in the living room, the candles eventually relit but offering little comfort. Max refused to return, staying hidden upstairs, his whines echoing faintly through the house. David couldn't shake the feeling that the night's events were only the beginning. The overturned rice, the extinguished candles, Max's uncharacteristic behavior, they all pointed to something beyond his understanding. And as he sat in the dim glow of the altar, his mother's last words echoed relentlessly in his mind. "It's there, Dot." Part 5. A hidden photograph. The storm that night was relentless, a raging orchestra of thunder and wind that shook the windows and seemed to seep into every corner of the house. David had barely slept since the unsettling events of the previous nights. The overturned rice, Max's eerie growling, and the whisper that sounded like their mother had left him rattled. He couldn't escape the oppressive feeling that the house itself was alive, watching, waiting. Michael, ever the skeptic, had insisted they focus on cleaning up and organizing their mother's belongings. "Maybe there's something in her things that explains all this," he suggested. David had agreed, though he wasn't sure if he was searching for answers or merely clinging to hope. The two brothers spent the morning going through old cabinets, drawers and boxes tucked away in forgotten corners of the house. They worked mostly in silence, the rain outside a constant backdrop. Occasionally one of them would find a trinket, a piece of jewelry, a handwritten recipe, or an old letter that brought a bittersweet smile or a pang of sorrow. By early afternoon they had moved to the kitchen. The air there was colder, heavier, and each creak of the floorboard seemed louder than it should have been. David paused, rubbing his temples as a dull headache began to set in. "You okay?" Michael asked, glancing up from the lower cabinets he was rifling through. "Yeah, just tired," David replied, though his unease was far deeper than exhaustion. Michael nodded and returned to his search. A few moments later, he froze, his hand hovering over a small stack of papers. "Hey David, take a look at this." David walked over as Michael pulled out a faded photograph from beneath a pile of old grocery lists. The edges of the photo were frayed, the colors muted with age. It depicted their mother, much younger, standing in front of a modest wooden house. She cradled a baby in her arms, smiling softly at the camera. David frowned. That's not me. And it's not you. Michael shook his head. No, it's not. The two brothers stared at the photograph, the storm outside rumbling ominously, as if echoing their growing confusion. David felt a chill run down his spine. Their mother had never mentioned another child. She had always spoken of the two of them, and only them, as the center of her world. Who do you think it is? David asked, his voice low. Michael shrugged, but his unease was evident. Maybe it's a cousin or a friend's baby. I don't know. But why would she keep this photo hidden? David's thoughts raced. He flipped the photo over, hoping for a clue. On the back, in their mother's familiar handwriting, was a single word. Him. The simplicity of the word sent a jolt through David's chest. Him. The same word scrawled in the note he had found days earlier. The same word that had lingered in his mother's final, cryptic instructions. Is there? What does this mean? David muttered, more to himself than to Michael. Michael leaned against the counter, his face pale. I don't know, but this is weird, David. Even for you. David ignored the jab. He couldn't take his eyes off the photograph. There was something unnerving about it, something that felt out of place. His mother's expression, though soft and warm, seemed almost forced, and the baby, wrapped in a white blanket, was turned slightly away from the camera, its face partially obscured. Do you think she? David hesitated, the question almost too absurd to voice. Do you think she had another child? Before us, Michael's mouth opened as if to respond, but no words came out. Instead, they both jumped as a sudden clap of thunder shook the house, rattling the dishes in the cabinets. The lights flickered, plunging the room into brief darkness before stabilizing. Okay, this is getting ridiculous, Michael said, forcing a laugh that didn't quite mask his nerves. It's just a storm, that's all. Is it? David countered, his voice sharp. You felt it, haven't you? The way this house feels different now. It's like something's watching us. Michael didn't reply. He didn't have to. The look in his eyes said it all. The photograph stayed with David long after they stopped searching. That night, he sat alone in the living room, the photo clutched tightly in his hands. The candles on the altar burned steadily, their light casting flickering shadows across the walls. Max lay curled up at his feet, his breathing shallow and restless. David turned the photo over again, his thumb brushing against the word him. He couldn't shake the feeling that his mother had kept this hidden for a reason. But why? And why was she trying to draw his attention to it now, after her death? A sudden noise broke his thoughts, a faint tap against the window. David's head snapped up, his heart pounding. The rain was still falling, but this sound was different. It was deliberate, rhythmic. Tap, 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 thought. He stood, clutching the photo, and approached the window cautiously. Outside, the storm raged, the wind howling through the trees. But there was nothing there, no branches brushing against the glass, no birds seeking shelter. Then he saw it. Pressed against the outside of the glass was a pale, ghostly handprint. David stumbled back, his breath catching in his throat. The handprint was faint but unmistakable, its outline shimmering faintly in the candlelight. He backed away from the window, his mind racing. Was it the storm playing tricks on him, or was it something else, something connected to the photograph? David Susan's voice startled him, and he turned to see her standing in the doorway, her expression filled with concern. What's wrong? He held up the photograph, his hand trembling. Look at this, look at the back. It says him. Do you think she's trying to tell us something? Susan took the photo, studying it carefully. Her face paled as she read the word. David, this is your mother's handwriting. I know, David said, his voice tight, but I don't know what it means. I don't even know who this is. Susan was about to respond when Max let out a low growl, his body tensing as he stared at the window. His growl turned into a bark, sharp and urgent, and he darted toward the altar. The candles flickered violently, their flames bending as if caught in a gust of wind, but the air in the room was still, suffocatingly so. David grabbed Susan's arm, pulling her back as the room seemed to grow colder by the second, and then, from somewhere deep within the house, came a whisper. "It's there, ... The voice was faint, barely audible over the sound of the storm, but it was enough to send a chill down David's spine. He turned to Suzanne, her wide eyes mirroring his own fear. "We need to find out who this baby is," he said, his voice steady despite the panic rising in his chest. "And we need to do it now," Susan nodded, clutching the photograph tightly. "Whatever's happening, David, I think it's only going to get worse until we figure it out." Part 6. A ghostly apparition. The storm showed no signs of relenting that night. Sheets of rain lashed against the windows, and the howling wind seemed almost to penetrate the walls, rattling the old house to its core. The family huddled in the living room, their faces pale and drawn. The photograph David and Michael had found sat on the coffee table, its edges curling slightly under the oppressive humidity. David's mind raced as he stared at the image, the word hymn etched on the back feeling heavier with every passing second. Who was the child in the photograph? Why had their mother hidden this piece of her life from them? And most unsettling of all, why did her spirit seem desperate to remind them now, after death? The unease that had been simmering for days boiled over into outright dread. The air in the room felt thick, oppressive, as though some unseen force were pressing down on them. Max, their usually calm Labrador, paced back and forth, whining softly, his ears pinned back. Every so often he'd stop, stare into the darkened hallway, and growl low in his throat. "I can't take this anymore," Michael muttered, breaking the tense silence. His hands fidgeted nervously, and he avoided looking at the photograph. "This is insane. We're sitting here scaring ourselves when there's probably a simple explanation for all of it." David shot him a sharp look. A simple explanation? For the rice bowl, the dog, the candles going out by themselves? For this he jabbed a finger at the photograph. "This isn't just grief, Michael. Something's happening here, and we can't ignore it." Michael ran a hand through his hair, his skepticism faltering. "So what are you saying? That mom's haunting us?" "Maybe she's not haunting us," Susan interjected, her voice soft but steady. "Maybe she's trying to tell us something. But why this way?" The question hung in the air like a lead weight. Who answered? David looked at the photograph again, his gaze lingering on the baby's obscured face. He felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up, a deep, primal instinct warning him of something unseen. "Whatever it is," David said finally, "I don't think she's at peace." The clock struck midnight, the chime echoing hollowly through the house. The candles on the altar flickered as if caught in a phantom breeze, their flames dancing erratically. Max's growl deepened, and he positioned himself protectively in front of the family, his body rigid and alert. Then the temperature in the room plummeted. Suzanne gasped, wrapping her arms around herself. "Why is it so cold all of a sudden?" David opened his mouth to respond, but a new sound stopped him short, a faint, rhythmic creak, like footsteps on old wood. The noise came from the hallway, growing louder with each passing second. All eyes turned toward the doorway, dread pooling in the pit of their stomachs. The footsteps stopped. The house fell silent once more, save for the sound of the rain outside. Then she appeared. At first it was just a shadow, barely distinguishable from the darkness of the hallway. But as the family watched, frozen in place, the figure became clearer, stepping slowly into the dim light of the living room. It was her, their mother. But this wasn't the warm, comforting presence they remembered. This was something else entirely. Her form was translucent, glowing faintly, and her face was a mask of rage. Her eyes, usually so gentle, burned with an unnatural fire. Her mouth twisted into a grimace, and her hands were clenched into tight fists. David's breath caught in his throat. Mom, the apparition, raised a trembling hand, pointing directly at the family. Her voice, when it came, was a guttural, otherworldly wail that sent chills racing down their spines. "You've forgotten him." The words echoed through the room, impossibly loud, reverberating in their ears long after she had stopped speaking. David's heart pounded in his chest as he tried to make sense of her accusation. Forgotten who, he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. "What are you talking about?" Her eyes bore into him, unrelenting. She pointed again, this time toward the altar. The candles flared brightly, their flames shooting upward before extinguishing in unison, plunging the room into darkness. Suzanne let out a strangled cry as she clung to David's arm. Michael, pale and trembling, backed against the wall, his eyes wide with terror. Max barked furiously, but the sound seemed small, insignificant, against the oppressive presence that filled the room. David fumbled for the flashlight on the coffee table, his hands shaking so badly he almost dropped it. When he finally managed to switch it on, the beam of light swept across the room, but their mother's spirit was gone. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sound of their ragged breathing. She was right there, Michael whispered, his voice cracking. That was her, wasn't it? But what does she mean? Who have we forgotten? David sank into the nearest chair, his mind racing. The photograph, the note, the whispered words. It all pointed to the same thing, someone they didn't know about, someone their mother had kept hidden. But why? And what had happened to them? I think David began, his voice trembling. I think she's angry, not at us, but at something we don't understand. And until we figure it out, I don't think she'll leave us alone. Michael shook his head, his hands gripping his hair. This doesn't make any sense. Why wouldn't she tell us when she was alive? Why now? Susan placed a hand on his shoulder, her own fear barely contained. Maybe she couldn't. Maybe whatever happened was too painful for her to talk about. But it's clear she wants us to know now. David stared at the photograph on the table, his stomach twisting into knots. The baby in the picture seemed to stare back at him, a silent reminder of their mother's final, desperate message. You've forgotten him. The words echoed in his mind, carrying with them an overwhelming sense of guilt and dread. Whoever he was, David knew they had to uncover the truth. Because until they did, their mother's spirit and whatever dark force seemed to follow her would not rest. For the rest of the night, none of them dared to sleep. The storm outside continued to rage, but it was nothing compared to the storm brewing within the house. The photograph remained on the table, a tangible connection to the mysteries that plagued them. And in the darkness, David couldn't shake the feeling that his mother's eyes were still watching, waiting, accusing. Part 7. Uncovering the Secret. The storm had passed by morning, but the house remained shrouded in an unnatural stillness, as if even nature was holding its breath. David sat at the dining table, the faint light of dawn filtering through the rain-streaked windows. In his hands was the photograph they had found the day before, the image of their mother cradling a child they had never known. The single word scrawled on the back, him, felt heavier now, almost accusatory. Suzanne entered the room, a steaming cup of coffee in her hands. She placed it in front of David without a word, her eyes mirroring the exhaustion etched on his face. She hadn't slept either, none of them had, not after what they'd witnessed the night before. She's not going to let this go, Susan said softly, breaking the silence. David nodded. I know, we need to find out who he is. The three of them, David, Suzanne, and Michael, gathered in their mother's room, determined to uncover the truth. It felt invasive, rifling through her personal belongings, but desperation outweighed the guilt. Every drawer, every box, every hidden corner was carefully searched. Hours passed, and the pile of old letters, faded photographs, and trinkets grew on the bed. Most of it was mundane recipes scrawled on scraps of paper, birthday cards from years ago, pressed flowers that crumbled to the touch. But nothing hinted at the existence of another child. This isn't getting us anywhere, Michael muttered, rubbing his temples. What if we're wrong? What if this is just grief making us see things that aren't there? David didn't respond. He had moved to the wardrobe, a large, creaky piece of furniture that had been a fixture in their mother's room for as long as he could remember. It was packed with clothes that still carried her faint scent of lavender and soap. As he pushed aside the hangers, his fingers brushed against something solid at the back. "What's this?" he murmured, his curiosity piqued. He pulled out a small locked box, its surface worn with age. The metal clasp was rusted, but it gave way easily under a bit of pressure. Inside was a collection of papers, neatly folded and yellowed with time. David's heart raced as he picked up the first document. It was a birth certificate. The name on the certificate made David's breath catch in his throat. Benjamin Carter. The date of birth was decades earlier, long before David or Michael were born. But the space for the mother's name was unmistakable. It was their mother. David handed the paper to Michael, who stared at it in stunned silence. "Benjamin." "Carter? Who the hell is Benjamin? There's more," Susan said, her voice trembling as she pointed to another paper in the box. David pulled it out, his hands shaking. It was a death certificate. The name was the same, Benjamin Carter. The cause of death was listed as stillbirth. The date matched the birth certificate exactly. "Oh my God," Susan whispered, covering her mouth. She had a baby, and he didn't survive. The weight of the revelation settled heavily over the room. David's mind raced, piecing together fragments of memories and conversations with their mother. She had never spoken of another child, never hinted at the pain she must have carried in silence. But now it made sense, her overprotectiveness, the way she clung to them, as if terrified of losing them too. "She never told us," Michael said, his voice a mixture of anger and sorrow. "Why wouldn't she tell us?" "Maybe she couldn't," Susan replied gently. "Think about it, Michael. Losing a child like that, it's something people don't talk about, especially back then. She probably buried it, tried to move on." David sat down on the edge of the bed, the death certificate still in his hands. The baby's name echoed in his mind, Benjamin. He wasn't just a forgotten photograph or a faded memory. He had been real, if only for a brief, tragic moment. And now his spirit was crying out for recognition. The realization hit David like a punch to the gut. "That's what she meant," he said, his voice trembling. "When she said you've forgotten him, she was talking about Benjamin. She wanted us to know." Michael paced the room, his frustration boiling over. "But why now? Why not tell us when she was alive? Why wait until Until this," he gestured vaguely, his words failing him. "Because she's still carrying him," Susan said softly, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Her spirit can't let go. She's bound to him, just like he's bound to her. They're both trapped." David felt a chill run through him. It made sense in a way he couldn't fully articulate. His mother had spent her entire life pretending Benjamin never existed, but in death she couldn't ignore him anymore. And now she needed their help to set things right. That evening the family gathered around the altar, the photograph of their mother and the certificates placed carefully beside the offerings. David lit the candles with trembling hands, their flickering flames casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. The air was thick with incense and tension. "We need to acknowledge him," David said, his voice steady but heavy with emotion. "That's what she wants. To know that we haven't forgotten him." Susan nodded, placing her hand on his shoulder. "You're right. Let's do this for her and for him." Michael, though still visibly shaken, joined them. Together they bowed their heads in prayer, their voices blending into a soft, mournful chant. They spoke Benjamin's name aloud for the first time, a fragile offering to the child they had never known. As the prayers continued, a strange calm settled over the room. The oppressive weight that had lingered for days seemed to lift, replaced by something softer, almost peaceful. The candles burned steadily, their light warm and reassuring. Then, just as they finished, a faint breeze swept through the room, carrying with it the faint scent of lavender. It wasn't cold or menacing, but gentle, like a mother's touch. The family looked at one another, their eyes wide with wonder. "Do you feel that?" Susan whispered. David nodded, a lump forming in his throat. He turned toward the photograph, and for a fleeting moment he thought he saw her, his mother's spirit, standing beside the altar. She wasn't angry this time. Her face was calm, her eyes filled with gratitude, and then she was gone. The house fell silent once more, but it was a different kind of silence, peaceful, not oppressive. Max, who had been hiding in the corner, padded over to the family, his tail wagging gently. Even he seemed to sense the change. David picked up the photograph, holding it close to his chest. He felt a sense of closure, bittersweet but undeniable. His mother and Benjamin were no longer trapped, their spirits finally free. But as he stared at the altar, a single thought lingered in his mind. What other secrets had she taken to her grave? Part 8. The Final Ritual. The house felt quieter, but not at peace. After the revelation of Benjamin's existence, the air seemed charged with something unspoken, a palpable anticipation hanging over the family. The photograph and the birth and death certificates now sat on the altar, their presence both a reminder of the sorrow they had uncovered and a symbol of the closure they hoped to achieve. David stared at the altar, his mind a swirling storm of emotions. His mother's ghostly cry, "You've forgotten him," still echoed in his head. Her anguished expression burned into his memory. It wasn't just grief or confusion haunting the family, it was guilt. Their mother's hidden pain, her silence, and the unacknowledged existence of Benjamin had tethered her spirit to this house, and now it was up to them to help her and him find peace. "I think we need to do a proper ritual," David said that afternoon, his voice resolute despite the weight pressing on him, not just for Mom but for Benjamin too. "If we don't, I don't think this will ever stop." Michael looked skeptical, pacing near the kitchen door. "You really think some candles and prayers are going to fix this? We're dealing with something. I don't even know what this is anymore." Susan placed a calming hand on Michael's arm. "It's not about fixing it," she said gently. "It's about acknowledging them, both of them. Mom kept Benjamin a secret her whole life, and now that secret is tearing her apart. This is about showing her and him that we see them, that we care." Michael stopped pacing, sighing deeply. "Fine. What do we need to do?" The family spent the rest of the day preparing. Suzanne suggested adding a new offering to the altar, something specifically for Benjamin. They decided on a small bowl of milk and a soft white blanket, symbolic of the care he never received in life. They also prepared their mother's favorite dishes: rice, steamed vegetables, and herbal tea. The storm that had plagued the house for days returned as night fell, lightning slicing through the sky and thunder rumbling in the distance. The flickering lights and the relentless sound of rain only heightened the tension as they walked. Max, the family dog, lingered nervously near the altar, his ears twitching at every creak and groan of the old house. By the time the altar was ready, it was nearly midnight. The family stood before it, their faces illuminated by the faint glow of the candles they had just lit. The atmosphere was heavy but solemn, the kind of quiet that demanded reverence. David stepped forward first, his hands trembling as he placed the photograph of their mother and the certificates in front of the offerings. He bowed his head, the words coming hesitantly at first but growing stronger with each syllable. "Mom, Benjamin, we're sorry for everything, for not knowing, for not remembering. We didn't understand, but now we do. Please let us help you find peace." His voice cracked on the last word, and Suzanne gently took his hand, squeezing it for support. She added her own prayer, her voice steady but thick with emotion. "We see you, Benjamin. We know you're here. And we want you to know that you're loved. Mom, we understand now. You don't have to carry this anymore." Michael, though reluctant at first, eventually stepped forward. His words were shorter, but they carried the weight of sincerity. "Mom, if you're listening, we're here. We'll make it right. I promise." As their prayers filled the room, the candles began to flicker, their flames dancing wildly, as if caught in an invisible wind. The air grew colder, and Max whimpered softly. pressing himself against Susan's legs. A faint, almost imperceptible hum filled the room, resonating through their bones. David looked up, his heart pounding. The shadows on the walls seemed to move, stretching and shifting in ways that defied explanation. The smell of lavender, his mother's signature scent, wafted through the air, growing stronger with each passing moment. Then the room grew still. The flames steadied, their glow casting a warm, golden light over the altar. The oppressive weight that had hung over the house lifted slightly, replaced by something softer. It was as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting. And then she appeared. Their mother's spirit materialized near the altar, faint but unmistakable. Her translucent form was no longer twisted with rage. Instead, her face was calm, her eyes glistening with what looked like tears. She looked at the family, her gaze softening with gratitude. David felt his knees weaken as he stepped closer. "Mommy," whispered. She didn't speak, but she nodded slowly, her expression filled with a bittersweet mixture of love and sorrow. Her hand reached out, pointing not at them this time, but at the altar, specifically at the small bowl of milk and the white blanket. As they watched, another form began to take shape beside her, smaller, frailer. The figure of a child, barely more than an infant, Benjamin. Susan gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. Michael took a step back, his eyes wide with disbelief. David felt his throat tighten as he looked at the tiny figure. Though indistinct, the child's presence was undeniable. He reached out a hand as if to touch them, but stopped short, afraid of breaking the fragile moment. The two spirits turned to one another, their forms glowing faintly. Their mother bent down, cradling the child in her arms, the same way she had in the photograph. A soft, warm light enveloped them, growing brighter and more radiant with each passing second. David felt tears streaming down his face. "We're so sorry," he choked out. "We love you." Both of you, the spirits, didn't speak, but their expression said everything. Gratitude, love, forgiveness. The light around them grew blinding, filling the room with a warmth that felt like an embrace. And then, slowly, they began to fade. When the light finally disappeared, the house was silent. The oppressive weight was gone, replaced by a peaceful stillness that felt almost sacred. The family stood in stunned silence, their hearts heavy yet strangely light. Max let out a soft bark, wagging his tail as if sensing the change. David knelt down, wrapping his arms around the dog, his tears soaking into Max's fur. Susan and Michael joined him, the three of them holding one another tightly. "They're gone," Susan whispered, her voice trembling. "They're finally at peace," David nodded, his gaze fixed on the altar. The candles burned steadily, their flames casting a warm, comforting glow. For the first time in days, he felt a sense of closure, a quiet assurance that they had done the right thing. As the family sat together in the soft light of the candles, they knew that their mother and Benjamin had finally found the peace they deserved. And though the pain of loss would always remain, it was tempered by the knowledge that they had helped their loved ones find their way home. Part 9. Peace restored, questions remain. The house stood silent, bathed in the soft glow of the candles on the altar. Outside, the storm had finally abated, leaving only the faint drip of water from the eaves and the occasional whisper of wind. For the first time in what felt like weeks, the oppressive weight that had clung to the house was gone. It was as though a veil had been lifted, revealing a clearer, lighter air. David sat at the dining table, staring at the altar. The remnants of the ritual remained: the bowls of rice, the white blanket, and the faint scent of lavender that lingered even after his mother and Benjamin's spirits had faded into the light. His hands rested on the edge of the table, trembling slightly, though he wasn't sure if it was from exhaustion or the overwhelming mix of emotions churning inside him. Michael entered the room, his footsteps cautious, as though he were afraid of disturbing the newfound peace. He slid into the chair across from David, his face pale but calm. "It's quieter now," he said softly. David nodded, not taking his eyes off the altar. Do you feel it? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Feel what? Michael replied, leaning forward. That. Peace, David said, exhaling slowly. It's like they're finally at rest, like we're free from whatever this was. Michael nodded, rubbing his hands together. Yeah, I feel it too. It's different, lighter. He paused, his expression clouding. Do you think they're gone? For good? David hesitated, the image of his mother cradling Benjamin's tiny form flashing in his mind. Her face, once contorted in rage and sorrow, had softened into something almost serene in her final moments. I think so, he said at last. She's with him now. That's all she wanted, to be with him, to be remembered. Susan entered then, carrying a tray of tea. She set it down gently, her movements deliberate, as though she too feared breaking the fragile calm. Max followed close behind, his tail wagging faintly, his earlier fear seemingly replaced by quiet contentment. The dog settled at David's feet, his warmth a small comfort against the lingering chill in the air. I still can't believe it, Susan said, sitting beside David and wrapping her hands around the steaming mug. I mean, we saw her. And Benjamin, they were really here. David nodded, running a hand through his hair. It feels like a dream. But it wasn't, was it? It was real. Susan shook her head. No, it wasn't a dream. I felt it, their presence, their pain. And then, that moment when they left, it was like the house itself exhaled, like it was finally free. Despite the peace, an ache lingered in David's chest. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself, but the question that had been gnawing at him for days refused to be silenced. He looked up at Susan and Michael, his voice heavy with uncertainty. Why didn't you tell us? He asked. Michael frowned, setting his mug down with a thud. What do you mean about Benjamin? David said, the name feeling both familiar and foreign on his tongue. Why did she keep him a secret? Why didn't she ever talk about him? Suzanne reached out, placing a hand on David's arm. Maybe it was too painful, she offered gently. Losing a child like that is something you never recover from, but to never say anything, David pressed, his frustration bubbling to the surface. Not even a hint. She spent her whole life carrying that burden, and we never knew. It doesn't make sense. Michael leaned back in his chair, his brow furrowed. Maybe she thought she was protecting us, or herself. People deal with grief in different ways, David. David stood, unable to sit still any longer. He began pacing the room, his mind racing. I feel like there's more to it. Like there's something we're still missing. Susan exchanged a glance with Michael. What are you saying? She asked cautiously. David stopped, turning to face them. I don't know, he admitted, his voice breaking. But doesn't it bother you that we might never understand why she hid this from us? That we might never know the full story? Michael sighed, rubbing his temples. Of course it bothers me, but what can we do about it? She's gone now, David. Whatever secrets she had, she took them with her, but she wanted us to find out, David countered. That's why all of this happened. She was trying to tell us something. Susan stood, crossing the room to stand beside David. Maybe what she was trying to tell us wasn't about her past, she said softly. Maybe it was about us, about how we needed to remember him, to remember her, to see her pain, even if it was too late to do anything about it. David looked at her, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. So we just let it go? Move on? Susan nodded, her expression filled with compassion. We move on, but we don't forget. We carry their memory with us, and we honor them by living the best lives we can. That's what she would have wanted. The words settled over David like a balm, soothing but not erasing the ache in his chest. He glanced at the altar once more, the candles burning steadily, their flames warm and steady. For the first time in days, he allowed himself to breathe deeply, to let go of the tension that had gripped him since his mother's passing. I'll try, he said finally, his voice quiet but determined. I'll try to let it go. Michael stood, clapping a hand on David's shoulder. We'll do it together, he said. All of us. Susan smiled, taking David's hand. Together. As the family stood together in the soft glow of the altar, the house seemed to hum with a quiet energy, not the oppressive weight of before, but something gentler, more welcoming. The eerie occurrences had stopped, the shadows had receded, and the air was no longer thick with tension. Instead, there was peace, and though the questions lingered, they no longer felt like chains holding them down. They didn't have all the answers, they might never have them, but they had each other, and they had the memory of their mother and Benjamin, two souls reunited, finally at rest. And for now, that was enough.